Welcome, everyone, to the Maintenance Mavericks Podcast, where we talk about trends in maintenance, reliability, and asset operations. My name is Ryan. I'm the CEO and founder of Upkeep. And for today's guest, I'm super excited to welcome here Rhys Davies. A little bit about Rhys. He's the global consulting leader for asset management and operations at a company called Atkins. And he's also the chair for the ISO committee that actually develops the ISO 55000 standards for asset management. Welcome, Rhys. How are you doing today? What's going on?
Hey, nice to meet you, Ryan. Yeah, I'm doing great. Summer's vaguely landed in the UK, so I'm based in the UK. It's like 20 degrees today, which for you guys is the upper 60s. So it's the first time it's been warm this year.
All right. Sounds like a beautiful day.
It is.
Well, hey, Rhys, I really appreciate you jumping on this podcast with us to share a little bit more about your experiences, knowledge about asset management. The way that we always kick this podcast off is have you share a little bit more about your journey and how you're first introduced to this industry and, hear a little bit more about what your journey's been like.
Yeah, I mean, I think the word introduced is probably too strong for my career experience. I kind of fell into asset management. I trained as an electronic engineer. That's what my degree is in. And my early career was as a systems design engineer. So I was designing systems which brought together kind of electronic, mechanical, other stuff to do things. And then very early on in my career, I kind of got introduced to the support system that goes around that. So reliability, maintainability, the MRO supply chain that wraps around that to make sure that we haven't just designed a good system in the first place, but we've wrapped around it all of the support infrastructure that means you can sustain that system through its life. And I think the final step in my evolution to asset manager was I went and studied an MBA, and that taught me about the organizational requirements, strategic requirements that wrap around that. And at the point in which you're thinking about how your assets and your asset systems are delivering organizational objectives and the organizational strategy, then at that point you are the asset manager. So I never set out to be an asset manager. I don't think it was a term 30 years ago, but I kind of fell into it. And it was just through growing that system bigger and bigger. System, support system, business system, asset manager.
That's awesome. And, something that I think all of our listeners know is, obviously the standard, the ISO 55000 standard. How did you get into that community? What made you passionate about, joining that and ultimately chairing that community?
Yeah, so I think that was kind of accidental. I was working at Lloyd's Register at the time, and somebody else I was working with circulated around a document called PAS 55, which is a British Standards Institution early document on asset management, and I commented too heavily on it. He said, "That's great. You can go and engage in the committee developing that." So I got involved in that, and then having worked with the Institute of Asset Management in the UK and British Standards Institution on 2 iterations of PAS 55, we said the next evolution is to take that into ISO and make that more international. And I happened to be in the room when they were filling in the form that said, "Does anybody volunteer to be the chair?" And I kind of volunteered to be the chair. So,
I mean, what an amazing journey, Rhys. I mean, I often feel like the people who have the most passion for things are oftentimes, the people that care the most, that want to drive the biggest change. And it's almost, I feel like, very rare to find people at the right time in their career that says, I can afford to do this. I want to do this and make a bigger change for the industry. Because I'm sure, Rhys, you have a million of other opportunities that you could be spending your time with. And, I think for all of us in this industry, really appreciate all the work that you've done to create these standards to really help and push our industry forward. So, one, want to say thank you for that. And then two, I want to ask you the question, what has made you stay passionate about this industry of asset management over the years?
I think you're right, Ryan. It is easy to say there's a degree of luck and serendipity about these things, but I think if you're passionate about things, and you're not afraid to be vocal about things, then you get drawn into things and people want to engage with you. And I think the thing that encourages me to be most vocal about asset management, I think, is that it's that element of trading off potentially conflicting factors. So we talk in asset management communities about asset management being deriving value from assets, but what we mean by value is often quite misunderstood. We're never clear about it. It's about that multi-dimensional trade-off between things like performance and cost and risk, and engaging outside of the engineering community in an organization, so that you're dealing with the maintenance community, the operations community, the obvious ones, but also the human resources area, the finance teams, the risk teams, the environmental teams, the safety teams. And I think it's that diversity, I think, that got me excited by it and wanting to help solve those problems in a more structured way. And if we kind of go back five years, that was all about, always described about a performance, cost, and risk trade-off. Mm-hmm. And that tended to mean that we gravitated back towards the traditional cost-benefit analysis in terms of justifying where we wanted to spend money, where we wanted to deploy scarce resources. And that meant we tended to be delivering efficiency or delivering reduced cost or saving money. And at heart, most engineers, most maintainers, most reliability experts are passionate about that long-term sustainment of their systems and keeping them going in a good way. And I've deliberately not used the word optimized there, but yeah. So it's that multi-dimensional thing. It's that time aspect. It's that pan-organizational thing that excites me.
That's awesome. So Rhys, obviously you've had decades of experience in this field, stayed passionate about it through the years, really wanted to drive a lot of change. Oftentimes on this podcast, we talk about contrarian views. So views that, that you believe other people might not share. I want to ask you, any contrarian views on asset management, views that you have that maybe people may not agree with?
I think, that's a good question. It's not so much that people don't necessarily agree with them. I think it's because we tend to drop back into that traditional investment appraisal, that traditional cost benefit analysis. We tend to hide behind words quite a lot. And I think with the advent of things like MultiCapitals approaches, the industry is able to kind of benefit from thinking that's happening in other fields and make ourselves more relevant. I think for a long time, asset managers have felt like we know what good is. We're very focused on the performance, cost, and risk. We're very focused on what we use the word value, but we never describe that very well. And I think that we can be better at that. And that's quite controversial at the moment because we've got 25, 30 years of asset management as a discipline, and there's lots of people out there who think that's well defined. And for me, I'm trying to shake that up and let's talk about value. What do we mean by value? What do we mean by multi-capitals?
Yeah. Can you share a little bit more about what does MultiCapitals actually mean? And how does that intertwine with asset management?
Yeah, so there's definitely a movement outside of the engineering and asset management communities, and it's coming from organizations like the Value Reporting Foundation, the Capitals Coalition, and what they're saying is that historically organizations, through things like GARP and the IFRS, International Financial Reporting Standards, we report all of our activities using financial metrics. So if you look on most organizations' balance sheets, they will talk about financial capital, and then there'll probably be an asset base in terms of your machinery, your pumps, pipes, whatever, buildings. And if you're in one of the more researchy industries like pharmaceuticals, then you've probably got a lump of money for intellectual property on there. And what these moves from Value Reporting Foundation, Capitals Coalition are saying is we should try and express our balance sheet in a more diverse way. So the six capitals model includes financial and manufactured capital. Yeah, we get those. We've always done those things. But then it says you should also report on human capital, environmental capital, social capital, and intellectual capital. And that starts to bring in a much broader range of diversity in the way that you are expressing the balance sheet of the organization. And if you think about that, at the most obvious level, all organizations are dependent upon the environment. All the raw materials we use come from the environment. The waste we use ends up in the environment in some way, shape, or form, whether that's processed waste or unprocessed waste. So the environment is there, and we should take that into account in the way we report our organization's activities. So I talk about the Value Reporting Foundation and the Capitals Coalition. They're probably the two big games globally, but they include big players like the World Bank, the Asia Development Bank, a collection of the internationally recognized accounting organizations. So this is very much trying to get organizations to evolve from quite basic reporting to more diverse reporting.
Yeah.
And for me, that makes it an exciting time to be an asset manager, because we've always tried to trade off conflicting factors, and we've hidden behind words like value. We've hidden behind words like tangible and intangible assets, physical and non-physical assets. And I firmly believe that we should be migrating towards the language of multi-capitals reporting. And you would be right to ask me why we should do that. And I think it's because what's the big discussion in every boardroom? It's climate change, it's ESG factors, it's sustainable development goals. And if we want to remain relevant as a discipline, then we need to use that language. And we can do. That language is made for our discipline. And my view is we are the solution to how you trade off these different conflicting factors, because that's what we've always done. We've always balanced off performance, cost, and risk. It's just a different way of measuring performance and risk and cost.
Yeah. I mean, I love that. I love the framework of, like, this idea of reporting on many different values. And I also love this framework of, like, asset management is actually a great, department to help run this balance between multiple, I think you called it multiple capitals or multiple values. I think the one thing that we've seen is, like, the nice thing about a single metric is that, like, it's one thing that everyone can point to and say, like, cool, I understand, I know what the goal is. But when you have these multiple different values, multiple capitals, who's ultimately responsible? And maybe the question is, like, what is asset management's responsibility in this new way of thinking?
I'm passionate about the fact that asset management is the solution to global sustainability. Absolutely. We should be at the heart of that discussion. What we are very good at, and what we should be responsible for doing, is that word value. I think we need to get better at expressing it. And we're not going to invent for our organization what we mean by value. If I go and talk to the health and safety team, that answer would be lower injuries, lower deaths. If I talk to the environmental team, it's cleaner, less pollution, lower CO2. So they're perceiving value, each of those, in a very one-dimensional way. Now, it should never be the engineers or the environmental people or the health and safety people or the finance people determining what value is. An organization's external and internal stakeholders all have a stake in the decisions that the organization makes. And it is those external and internal stakeholders which perceive value in the things the organization does. So when you ask me what's our responsibility, I think our responsibility is to help the organization engage with stakeholders internally and externally to understand how they perceive value. What is of value to them? Is it greater social value? Is it cleaner water? Is it greater profit? Because let's not get away from this. Finance still drives most of the world. It's called capitalism for a reason, and it's financial capitalism. So let's not forget the financial element. And if we can help organizations reach out to those stakeholder communities and then help the organization to define what what value means to that organization,
Yeah.
then we're 80% of the way there. Because once you understand what is of value, how does safety compare to environmental, compared to net zero, compared to financial return, compared to intellectual property? When you understand all of those trade-offs and the pluses and the minuses associated with them, you are then in a really strong position to make better decisions about where you invest your money, where you invest your scarce resources to deliver the outcomes our communities and our stakeholders need.
I love this vision, Rhys, and I fully understand, like, asset management is all about like balancing essentially like the short term, the midterm, and the long term. And in many ways, this multiple capital vision here is kind of the same thing. You have like, the financial returns, which is very, very acute, very happening right now. You have the ESG component, which is probably much more longer term, and then everything in between.
Yeah, and as stewards or custodians of assets, those assets inevitably span multiple business planning cycles, multiple financial reporting periods. I feel like we have a responsibility to remind people of that long-term nature and remind people of the long-term impact for genuine sustainability, not just carbon sustainability, but genuine sustainability.
What do you think some of the biggest challenges are going to be, or are they right now, in order to really transition, what I think many people believe is asset management today into this like bigger vision that I feel like you're painting?
Yeah, I was talking to my colleagues about that this afternoon. Loose language, I think, is a big challenge. We just, how many times have you been in an organization, have you heard the phrase, my initiative will add value? You will hear that daily. But I've started a mission to, when people use that phrase, I kind of go back and challenge them. Well, what do you mean by value? Is this financial value? Is it safety value? Is it environmental value? What is it? And I think we've got to get much better at defining that. Language is hugely important. I guess it's the one thing I learned in the early part of my career in migrating from being trained as an engineer to doing my MBA, is that the power of language is huge. Absolutely huge. And I think we don't define what we mean well. And I think we have to get better at defining what we mean when we say my initiative will add value, and thinking about that using MultiCapitals gives us, there's lots of ways of defining that, and value frameworks are not a new thing, but I think MultiCapitals gives us a way ahead that makes us as an asset management community more relevant in the ESG space, more relevant in the UN Sustainable Development Goals space, makes us more relevant in the net zero environmental sustainability space, because we start using the same language that they are. You kind of put yourself in the boardroom and you've got very passionate climate, environmental, safety people all communicating with the board and looking for those scarce resources and the scarce funding. But they tend to use language that the board understands. And then you've got the technical engineers coming in using language that's just very convoluted. And it's like, let's express our problems, not in terms of the vibration characteristic of my left sprocket wobbler, but in terms of, this is a risk to our meeting our environmental goals or our sustainability goals or our net zero goals. And I think getting that language right and changing the way we describe our technical problems into sustainability problems and ESG problems is a good way. The phrase that somebody in my meeting used today was loose language costs money. And I think loose language is our biggest challenge today. Let's tighten our language, but use language that the big communities that are getting the ear of the C-suite are using. And that means ESG factors, UN SDGs, climate change, all of those important factors.
Right. So if I were to kind of summarize that, it's like, as we move towards this bigger vision of being able to put value in more than just financial value, but also the ESG, the social IP components of it, it's going to come back to like, how do we define essentially like what that value actually is and be able to measure it? And ultimately, what I also hear too is like, how do we weight it to, yeah, again, to your point, like, how do we make these trade-offs between, the financial component versus the ESG component, IP component, the social component?
Yeah, and that ultimately comes down to understanding who your stakeholders are, understanding their needs, wants, and expectations. And it's interesting because I work in this international community in the ISO committee. It's interesting listening to non-first language members, non-first English language speakers in my committee. When they use the word stakeholders, they disaggregate that word in a way that as a native English speaker I wouldn't do, but it's technically correct what they're doing. They say, identify which stake your stakeholders have in the decision you're making. That is such a powerful phrase.
Yeah.
Because we talk about stakeholders, but we don't think about the stake they have in your decision. So when I decide to build a new wastewater treatment works, do I understand what stake the local community has in that? Yeah, they want wastewater to be treated, but do they want a wastewater treatment station next to where they live? So you need to understand the stake they have in it. And at that point, then you start to worry about, am I better off building new wetland areas that provide amenity space for the community, but still treat the water in the same way, grows biodiversity, reduces carbon because I'm pouring less concrete? You start to understand what is better. It's down to understand the needs, wants, and expectations of your stakeholders, internal and external. And that means we need to not make up what we think value is, but find out what our stakeholders perceive as being of value.
All right. I love that vision, Rhys. And I really appreciate you sharing all of this knowledge. I love the vision around, this idea of multiple capital. What we always do as we kind of like close out the show here is do a quick fire set of questions where I ask you a question, get your response in roughly about 20 seconds or less, just to kind of give our audience a few extra golden nuggets of information. You ready to jump into our quick fire set of questions?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. Our first question here, what's one trend in the asset management industry that you're really excited about for the future?
Yeah, that's easy. Sustainability generally, and the move to multi-capitals thinking, particularly the fact that the financial community and the accounting reporting bodies are getting engaged with multi-capitals reporting. That's gonna be a game changer for what we do, and it's a good game changer.
That's awesome. It sounds like it's already started too.
Yep.
Most important lesson that you've learned over your career?
Yeah, be better at communicating. As when I trained as an engineer, we weren't really taught to communicate. You've got to be better at communicating. You've got to be more precise with language. You've got to embrace thinking coming from other elements of the organization. It's about communication, and communication means listening as much as talking. Totally agree.
On that note, best resources that you'd recommend to our audience, what podcasts, books, trade shows, anything?
I mean, there's a lot of them around. There's quite a few international asset management organizations like the Institute of Asset Management website, the Global Forum for Maintenance and Asset Management. There's lots of them around. But I would say for something a little bit different, go and have a genuine, good, deep read around the Value Reporting Foundation's website for 6 capitals and the Capitals Coalition for 4 capitals. For 2 reasons. One, they provide quite a different perspective on the world and how they report things, but also I think it helps us understand what we mean by true sustainability to a much greater extent. That word sustainability has been claimed by the climate community, and yes, I'm 100% into that. But sustainability means sustainable communities. It means sustainable climate. It means sustainable business. It means sustainable investment. It's a much broader thing to think about, and being truly sustainable is good. So I'd say those Value Reporting Foundation, Capitals Coalition websites.
Awesome. Biggest takeaway you hope all of our listeners are going to take away from today's discussion? Yeah,
again, easy one. We need to define what we mean by value better. And that means engaging with your organization's stakeholders to understand what they perceive as being of value. That's the big one. Understand what is really of value, not what you think is of value.
All right. I love it. Rhys, really appreciate all of your time here. Can you share with all of our listeners the different ways that they can connect with you on your journey?
Yeah, for sure. So the two easiest ways are probably on my LinkedIn account. So if you look for Rhys Davies, there's not many of us, but you'll find me pretty easily on LinkedIn or via email. So I'm rhys.davies@atkinsglobal.com is a good way to get hold of me.
Awesome. Thank you again, Rhys. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in today's episode of the Maintenance Mavericks Podcast. My name again is Ryan. I'm the CEO and founder of Upkeep. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm super active. Or just shoot me an email, ryan@upkeep.com. I hope everyone enjoyed today's episode. And I look forward to connecting with all of you soon. Until next time, thank you again, Rhys.